Welcome to a Sherlock Holmes mystery. A locked door, a Christmas morning, and a death no one saw coming. A woman framed by silence, a killer hiding behind perfection. But the truth? It left ash where no fire ever burned. Before we begin, where are you listening from tonight? Tell us below. It was one of those bitter December mornings when London lay muffled under a thin quilt of snow, its rooftops glistening like sugared confections and the gas lamps burning faintly through the mist. I recall it vividly because Holmes had been in one of his long, silent moods, a condition which generally preceded some remarkable display of intellect or, conversely, a fit of restlessness that set the flat at Baker Street in a state of chaos. He sat by the fire, his long fingers steepled under his chin, the sharp lines of his face cast in shadow by the flickering light. A violin lay untouched beside him, its bow resting like a sleeping serpent across the strings. Outside, the clatter of carriage, wheels echoed faintly over the cobbles, mingling with the distant cries of vendors and the melancholy tolling of street Clement's bells. "I fancy, Watson," he said suddenly, without moving his gaze from the flames, "that there is a gentleman about to arrive who has walked precisely 2 miles through the slush, has recently been abroad, and has this morning read of a death that disturbs him greatly." Before I could inquire how on earth he could divine such details, there came a firm, almost frantic knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson ushered in a tall, well-dressed man of middle years, his coat speckled with melting snow. He bore that unmistakable look of nervous urgency I had come to associate with those who sought Holmes's aid, the look of a soul balanced upon the thin edge of calamity. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he began, removing his hat with trembling fingers. "My name is James Weatherby. I come on behalf of my uncle, Lord Eustace Weatherby of Kent. A most shocking matter has occurred this morning." Holmes inclined his head, his expression unreadable. "Pray, be seated, Mr. Weatherby. You have the aspect of a man haunted not merely by a misfortune, but by a mystery." The visitor obeyed, glancing nervously toward the window where snowflakes drifted past like falling ash. "My uncle was found dead in his study an hour after the household gathered for Christmas service. The door was locked from within. No sign of struggle. No weapon. And yet," he paused, voice faltering, "there was blood upon the hearthrug and a single glove laid upon the desk. Not his own." "Ah," said Holmes softly, his eyes glinting. "A locked room, a trace of blood, and an alien glove. A Christmas puzzle. Indeed." I saw the familiar gleam in Holmes's eyes, the kind that heralded a chase after the impossible. He rose, fetched his coat and hat, and turned to me with that quiet excitement that always preceded his greatest triumphs. "Come, Watson. There is frost in the air and something devilishly curious afoot. Let us see what manner of Christmas gift fate has placed upon our doorstep." And thus began that singular adventure which I have always regarded as one of Holmes's most haunting cases. The Christmas morning that even he, for all his brilliance, could never quite forget. Mrs. Hudson had scarcely closed the door behind our visitor before Holmes was in motion, coat over one shoulder and hat from its peg. Within the hour, Weatherby had us aboard the Charing Cross train, and we left London through a whitening country where fields took snow like sifted flour. Holmes sat with eyes half-lidded, fingers drumming once when the carriage swayed. When I asked if he expected poison or violence, he shook his head. "If the account is accurate, neither. Locked doors are seldom miracles, they are arrangements." The wind needled the panes. Weatherby Hall proved a square grey house, its avenue glazed with frost. Lady Honoria met us. She was composed, and grief in her case had stiffened resolve. Parsons, the butler, hovered behind her, a grave sentinel. "You will find everything as it was," she said. The room announced order. Books and ledgers, a fire banked to a steady glow. Lord Eustace sat before the walnut desk, shoulders slightly forward, as though a whisper might stir him. Death had lent his features a gentle slackness. On the rug lay a dark oval, stark against the weave. A single pale kid glove rested near the blotter. Holmes's survey was swift. He examined the forced door, fresh splinters, a wedge mark, then the window, latched within. The outer sill showed no footprint, only a pinch of grey grit at the left corner. He stooped to the rug, extended a penknife, and lifted a fibre. "Blood," he said quietly, "but not the aftermath of violence. It has pooled and cooled. The source is low, consider a small cut, or the nose." He bent over the body without touching it, inhaled once, and rolled back the left cuff. A chafe here at the wrist, a strap worn tight or tightened. I glanced at the glove. "A lady's," I observed. "Indeed." Holmes indicated a faint crescent smear upon the desk, visible only when the light struck it obliquely. "Face powder, of a granular sort. Note also that the glove's thumb is twisted. It was set down by one unpracticed or in haste. Weatherby, pressed for particulars, recounted the morning. Lord Eustace went to his study at 7:30 to review accounts for a charitable trust. The family left for church at 8, Parsons remaining to tend the fires. They returned at 9:15. The door was locked. The carpenter forced it. The body was found. My uncle had no enemies, Weatherby added. He was strict, but fair. Strictness and charity meet at cross purposes often, Holmes said. "Parsons, who visited last evening?" "Only Miss Beatrice Lane, sir," the butler replied. "Her ladyship's protégé. She sought his lordship's counsel. I served tea in the green drawing-room. She left before 10. Lady Honoria coloured. Miss Lane is a good girl. She has been unfortunate in money through a worthless cousin. Lord Eustace was advising her. Nothing more." Holmes bowed. He returned to the window, captured the grit in an envelope, and then, near the fender, teased from the ashes a small, crimped fragment of paper, a faint floral sweetness. He held it to me. "Egyptian tobacco," I said. "Just so, with a ghost of a tar. Yet the ashtray is immaculate." Our smoker was hurried, fastidious, or interrupted. He loosened the neckcloth and again drew that measured breath I had learned to trust as his surest instrument. A spark lit behind his eyes. "We will keep this room sealed," he said. "Weatherby, your carpenter, what tools did he employ? And where are they now? A wedge can mislead the eye as cleverly as any conjurer. After that, we must see Miss Lane." As we withdrew, I asked, "You think the glove a deliberate signpost?" "I think it a sentence," Holmes answered, drawing on his own gloves. "This room is a page, Watson. Someone has written upon it in powder, ash, and trifles. When a problem is made to look impossible, ask who profits from our bewilderment. The author will not hide from his punctuation." "His?" I ventured. Holmes's smile flickered. "Pronouns are dangerous at the start of a story. Come, we will speak first with the man who broke a lock, then with the woman who left no ash." The carpenter, a stolid man named Finch, met us in the servants' hall, his breath visible in the chill. He confirmed that he had forced the door with a cold chisel and mallet. Tools, now resting in a basket by the scullery. Holmes examined them without comment, then turned his attention to the wedge. Finch had used a thick scrap of oak, flat on one edge, tapered at the other. Holmes tested its fit at the door's frame. "A clever enough wedge," he murmured, "but not clever enough to conceal intention. Mr. Finch, when you struck the chisel, did the wood give resistance, or did the door burst inward?" "It gave a little, sir. Then it splintered sudden-like, just as if it had been ready to break." Holmes nodded once and turned back toward the main house. "Watson, we must speak with Miss Lane before the weather turns further. I fancy her memory may be sharpened by snow." Beatrice Lane received us in the music room, where she had been seated at the pianoforte. She was pale, with a delicacy not of constitution, but of some inner restraint, like one raised among the chime of clock towers and the hush of museum halls. Her fingers lingered on the keys even as we entered, as though reluctant to lose the melody they had not quite formed. "Miss Lane," Holmes said with gentleness uncharacteristic of his usual tone, "you spoke with Lord Eustace last evening." "Yes," she replied. "He had been reviewing documents for a property dispute, a trust from my father's estate. My cousin Gregory has been contesting it. Was your meeting cordial?" "Perfectly. Lord Eustace offered guidance, nothing more." She hesitated. "He was always rather formal with me." Holmes's gaze flicked to her gloves resting on the piano bench. "Do you own a pair of kid gloves, pale, grey or ivory in hue?" Beatrice blinked, then nodded. "Yes, a gift from Lady Honoria last spring." "May I see them?" She departed briefly and returned with the gloves, worn but intact. Holmes compared them closely to the single glove found in the study. The leather, the stitching, the perfume, he took each detail in with the practiced eye of a man who read truth in threads and buttons. At last, he returned both pairs to her. "Did you remove your gloves at any point during your visit?" Yes, I believe I did. When Parsons brought the tea, I placed them on the table beside me." "Did you retrieve them yourself?" Her brow furrowed. I assumed so. I cannot swear it. I left rather hurriedly. Gregory was waiting outside." "Ah, and you have not spoken to your cousin since?" "No, he departed that same night." "I haven't heard from him." "Yet he is known here?" "Gregory has dined with the family often, though my uncle distrusted him, I think." Holmes offered a quiet bow. "Thank you, Miss Lane. You've been most helpful." As we walked back through the hall, I asked, "Do you suspect the cousin?" "I suspect movement in the periphery," Holmes said. "Beatrice Lane is frightened, Watson, but not of her guilt. She fears implication. The lost glove is no mere accident. It was placed. Yet by whom? By someone who understands narrative. The mind that arranges a scene to imply guilt rather than to commit murder is a dangerous one indeed." We returned to the study briefly. Holmes examined the mark on the desk again, then retrieved the envelope containing the grit from the windowsill. "This powder," he said, "is not soot or soil, but granite dust. Quarrymen carry it, and so do masons. But Lord Eustace entertained neither. Someone came through that window not last night, but this morning, and returned it to its perfect state. Someone, precise, methodical." "An accomplice?" Holmes looked up sharply. "Or a narrator, Watson, one who writes their tale with gloves and wedges and ash that is never smoked. We must locate Gregory Lane before sunset." "How?" I asked. Holmes smiled. "We send word to the telegraph office. If he is as vain as I believe, he has left footprints of his own choosing. Every man with a motive fashions a trail. The trick is to see it not where it leads, but where it begins." The snow deepened as we returned to the village, where the narrow lanes twisted between hedgerows now half buried in white. Holmes remained uncharacteristically silent until we reached the local telegraph office, a small, ivy-clad structure beside the postmaster's cottage. He rapped once upon the window, and the young clerk inside, a lad with keen eyes and ink-stained fingers, rose to greet us. "I wonder," Holmes said, removing his gloves and producing a half-sovereign, "if you might recall whether a Mr. Gregory Lane sent a wire from here last evening, or perhaps received one." The boy's eyes brightened at the coin but dimmed slightly in thought. "Yes, sir. He came through just before 10. I remember because the clock was striking when he stepped in. Sent a telegram to London. Said it was urgent, something about a legal clerk at Boscombe Chambers." "Did he leave an address?" The clerk shook his head. "No, sir. But he asked when the early train ran. Seemed in a hurry." Holmes tapped the counter once. "You've been most helpful. One final favor: if a wire arrives addressed to Mr. Lane, please inform Lady Honoria directly, and say that Sherlock Holmes requests she delay replying until he returns." As we exited, I ventured, "Boscombe Chambers barristers' offices?" "Yes, and second-rate ones at that," Holmes replied. Lane is grasping at legal straws or seeking allies in haste. Either way, his panic is a crack in the facade. Back at Weatherby Hall, Holmes requested Parsons gather the household in the drawing room. The family assembled in a hush, the snow muffling all sound beyond the tall windows. Lady Honoria sat like a figure of carved ivory. Miss Lane stood at the fire with her eyes cast down. Weatherby himself leaned against the mantel, hands clenched behind his back. The others included the housemaid Rose, the cook Mrs. Branton, and Finch the carpenter, sturdy folk with suspicion clinging to their collars like damp wool. Holmes addressed them all with clarity and restraint. A crime has occurred in this house under the appearance of mystery. A man is dead in a locked room, with symbols left as now. Breadcrumbs, a blood stain, with no wound, a glove placed without its pair, and the suggestion of a lady's presence. I do not require confessions, but I do require truth. A ripple passed through the group, no gasps, no cries, but subtle tells. Finch, shifting weight from foot to foot, Rose swallowing hard, and Miss Lane's fingers tightening upon a handkerchief she did not use. Holmes paced slowly before the hearth. This was not a murder of passion, but of planning. Lord Eustace was neither struck nor strangled. He was poisoned quietly, efficiently by a dose delivered not the night before, but early this morning. A drug that produces cardiac arrest within an hour, easily confused for natural death. And what is more, he drank it voluntarily. Lady Honoria drew herself upright. That is absurd, Mr. Holmes. My husband would never— He would, if the poison lay in his morning tea, delivered by one he trusted, or by a hand he did not perceive as hostile. A hush fell. Watson leaned in beside me. He's stalling, I whispered, waiting for a reaction. But Holmes was not stalling. He was listening. Parsons, Holmes said quietly. You brewed the tea? The butler's voice was calm. I did, sir. And you delivered it? Yes, sir. I placed it on the study tray, knocked, and left it outside. His lordship took it in. No one else handled it? No, sir. Holmes nodded, his gaze fixed on the tray. And yet, he said, stepping toward it, the cup bears a fingerprint, faint, but distinct, and not yours. He turned, producing a small glass plate from his coat. Upon it, a smudge of face powder mingled with Egyptian tobacco ash. This was found beneath the window. The same ash we traced to a cigarette burned hastily. Not by Lord Eustace, he never smoked. He let the silence stretch a beat longer. Miss Lane, Holmes said softly, you left your gloves in the drawing room. One was taken, not by you, but by someone who wished the scene to speak of you. You were made a character in a play you did not write. Beatrice looked up sharply. Then who? Holmes turned to Weatherby. You asked for help too quickly. Arranged our arrival, controlled the timeline, provided details before they were requested. You poisoned your uncle's tea, and the ash at the window was yours. Weatherby's face drained. You can't prove. You wore gloves when you placed the wedge. You left none of your fingerprints, save one on the teacup, but what sealed it was the grit from your heel granite dust from the masons at Kensington Square, the same you passed through yesterday while visiting Boscombe Chambers. You sought to forge a witness. The narrative was yours, Mr. Weatherby, but you underestimated the editor. Weatherby lunged only for Finch and Parsons to seize him. The room erupted in whispers as Lady Honoria looked on in frozen horror. Holmes exhaled softly. And so, he murmured, another tale concludes. But this one, I fear, is not yet over. Weatherby's struggle ceased as quickly as it had begun. His shoulders slumped between the firm arms of Finch and Parsons, who held him with the grave finality of men unshocked by betrayal, only saddened by it. Beatrice Lane stared at him. Her lips parted in disbelief, while Lady Honoria remained rigid in her chair, her gloved hands white against the dark wool of her mourning dress. For several moments, no one spoke. Then Weatherby, with a sudden, bitter laugh, straightened himself as best he could. I underestimated no one, he hissed, his voice rough with fury. Least of all you, Holmes. I knew the moment your name was mentioned, I was racing against time. I had to get ahead of you, or at least make the trail thick enough that even your genius would lose its way. Holmes's expression was unreadable. Yet it was the trail you laid that revealed you. You tried too hard to write your own legend. Watson, ever the observer of human frailty, took a quiet step closer. Why, Weatherby? Why now? On Christmas morning? A bitter sneer curled the man's lips. Why? Because the old man held the strings to everything. My allowance, my future, he was going to revoke it all. Said I lacked the moral fiber to inherit the estate. He'd planned to cut me out of the will at the new year and hand the entire Weatherby fortune over to charitable trusts, his legacy to Britain, he called it. I would have been left with nothing. Lady Honoria's eyes widened in horror. He never told me. No, he wouldn't have. You were always his confessor, never his conspirator. Weatherby muttered bitterly. He treated me like a clerk in his bank, not like his blood. Holmes watched him intently. So you plotted your uncle's death, but not with violence. You relied on illusion. The poison digitalis, no doubt administered subtly, with no outward signs. Wedge placed to give the impression of a door forced from the outside. The glove to suggest a woman's presence. The ash, exotic and rare, to conjure a mysterious visitor. But the thread unraveled too easily. You weren't supposed to arrive so soon, Weatherby muttered. I thought I'd have the day. Enough time to direct suspicion where I chose it to fall. Beatrice spoke then, her voice low but steady. So you meant to have me blamed? Weatherby turned toward her, his defiance momentarily faltering. No, not truly. I only meant for there to be doubt. Just enough to confuse things. You were convenient an outsider, and someone my uncle didn't entirely trust. She recoiled, not from fear, but from the profound wound of betrayal. Lestrade arrived half an hour later, summoned by telegram. Holmes, having anticipated the endgame, had already alerted Scotland Yard before we left London that morning. The detective inspector arrived in a swirl of scarf and authority. And though not always quick to grasp Holmes's deductions, he followed the evidence with commendable clarity. Poison, eh? Lestrade muttered, examining the tea tray. Never a blade or a bullet with these society types. Quiet murder, that's the thing now. You'll give me the full breakdown at Scotland Yard, Mr. Holmes. With pleasure, Holmes replied. Though you'll find, I think, that the motive is as old as Cain. Weatherby was taken away under guard, his silence resumed, though he cast one last glance toward the snow-covered hedgerows as if they might still offer him some avenue of escape. Later, we stood once more in Lord Eustace's study. The fire had been rekindled, but the air remained cold with finality. Beatrice Lane had retired, pale and worn. Lady Honoria had not shed tears, but the lines of grief carved themselves into her already delicate features. Holmes approached the desk, his eyes scanning its contents one final time. He planned it meticulously, he murmured, almost to himself, but he forgot that too much cleverness is its own confession. I stood beside him, watching the fire flicker against the glass decanter near the window. "And the glove?" I asked. "How did you know it was placed?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Because it was too clean. Every other object in the room bore some sign of contact, dust, ash, a trace of moisture. But the glove was pristine, set down carefully, with the thumb twisted just enough to make it noticeable. Real fear, real haste. They leave fingerprints of disorder. Weatherby left a monologue instead. He turned toward the window, where snow continued to fall silently upon the grounds of Weatherby Hall. Christmas morning, Watson. A time for gifts, for grace, and for masks to fall. And for a long moment, neither of us spoke. The quiet held the weight of judgment. The return to Baker Street that evening was a quiet one. The train rolled through the snow, veiled countryside with a hush that matched the mood in our compartment. Holmes had withdrawn into his customary silence, a cigarette smoldering between his fingers, his gaze fixed not on the passing fields, but somewhere far deeper within the intricate corridors of memory. I knew better than to interrupt. It wasn't until we had stepped once again into our familiar sitting room, where Mrs. Hudson had kindly laid out a modest supper of cold roast and bread, that Holmes finally stirred. "I trust," he said, settling into his armchair and reaching for his violin, "that Scotland Yard will file this case under resolved by intervention, rather than solved by routine." "They'll take the credit as they always do," I replied, taking my seat across from him. Though Lestrade was unusually gracious today. Holmes offered a faint smile. Even a terrier knows when the fox was never his to begin with. I poured myself a small glass of sherry and leaned forward. "There's one thing still troubling me. You said Weatherby's plan was a monologue, that his clues were too perfect. But surely it was still a considerable risk. If Parsons had entered the room too soon, or Beatrice had demanded a second meeting, any number of variables could have spoiled it." Holmes tuned the violin slowly, the notes thin and precise. "That, Watson, is the fatal flaw in all staged crimes. They require the world to behave like a theater. But the world resists scriptwriters. Weatherby believed his plan accounted for every possibility. He counted on the visual narrative, a glove, a trace of powder, the false suggestion of romantic intrigue to arrest the minds of lesser men. He played a slow arpeggio, then paused, but he did not count on the imperfections of reality. The wedge, for example, was two fresh splinters, showed no sign of aging. The ash too fine, too curated, almost ceremonial. And the poison, though subtle, left a trace in the tea. Leaves I kept for analysis. You took the leaves? I did. Even in death, a teacup can speak volumes. I leaned back and exhaled. Still, it was a devilish scheme, and all for money. Holmes's fingers stilled on the strings. Not merely money. Weatherby had grown up under the shadow of legacy. His uncle's approval was withheld like a pension, always just out of reach. He wanted not merely wealth, but authority. To be the master, not the ward. Murder was the cost of self-definition. He rose, paced slowly toward the fireplace, and stirred the embers with the iron poker. What fascinated me most, however, was the structure of his illusion. Every misdirection he planted was theatrical. The lone glove symbolic, the locked door classic, the suggestion of a woman, of a secret tryst archetypal. He wasn't just removing an obstacle, he was writing a mystery. And he almost got away with it. Holmes turned, the fire casting sharp lines across his face. "Almost, Watson," but then he invited me in. He said it with no boastfulness. It was simply fact, as though, once introduced to the problem, his involvement was inevitable and the outcome preordained. There was a brief knock, and Mrs. Hudson entered with an envelope. "Telegram for you, Mr. Holmes. Delivered just now." He took it with a nod and opened it by the firelight. "Well?" I asked after a moment. Holmes's brow furrowed slightly. "It's from Inspector Lestrade. The contents of Weatherby's room have been inventoried. Among his belongings was a letter half finished, never posted, addressed to Beatrice Lane." "A confession?" "No." Holmes handed me the telegram. "An apology." I read the brief summary. The letter was neither emotional nor overtly remorseful. It explained, in clipped, precise sentences, how Weatherby had not intended for Beatrice to suffer only to serve as a distraction. He claimed he respected her, that he hoped she would not hate him, that perhaps, in another world, things might have been different. "Delusion," I muttered. "Perhaps," Holmes said, taking the letter back. "But the final sentence intrigues me." He read aloud. "I never wanted to be the villain, only the victor. Roundhill. But victors, I suppose, must sometimes write history in someone else's blood." The fire popped once, sharply. Holmes returned the letter to the envelope. "Well, Watson," he said with a sigh, "what remains is the snow, the silence, and the case. All three, for now, are complete. And, as the bells of street Pancras chimed the 11th hour, we sat in silence, two men alone in the still heart of London, while outside the city slumbered beneath a blanket of snow Holmes would never quite forget. The days following the Weatherby affair passed in a quiet procession of snowfalls and stillness. London moved on in its heavy winter overcoat, and for once, no telegrams rattled through our mornings. No boots thudded up the Thames stairs in frantic desperation. It was a silence Holmes accepted with his usual aloofness, but which I, ever drawn to resolution, could not quite abide. I found him in the late afternoon, seated in his armchair, the remains of a pipe lying cold beside him, and the Times folded unread on his knee. He was staring into the fire with an intensity that betrayed more than idle thought. He did not look up as I approached. "You are still thinking of Beatrice Lane," I said. Holmes did not respond immediately. Then, with a soft exhalation, "A woman written into a crime as an accessory by implication." Weatherby, for all his calculation, underestimated the weight of narrative. Once cast in the role of temptress, no amount of silence would cleanse her in the eyes of the public. "I suppose she will suffer still," I murmured. Even with Weatherby's arrest, gossip does not require truth to take root. Precisely. It needs only a whisper and a glove. Holmes stood and crossed to the table where he had laid out the remnants of the case. A folded copy of the coroner's report, the letter Weatherby had begun to. Beatrice, the laboratory results confirming digitalis in the tea leaves, and a clipping from a local paper in Kent. The last bore the unkind heading, "Society Beauty Linked to Christmas Tragedy." "I should never have left that loose," Holmes said grimly, tapping the article. "I underestimated the press's hunger for scandal. While I was solving the case, someone else was writing its sequel." I stared at the cruel ink. "She deserves better." "She does." He turned sharply. "And so she shall have it. We are not finished with this story, Watson. Not yet." The next morning, we departed early for Kent, Holmes having dispatched a note ahead to Lady Honoria. Beatrice was still staying at Weatherby Hall, it seemed, assisting in the painful task of sorting Lord Eustace's personal papers. The reception upon our arrival was restrained, but courteous. Lady Honoria received us in the smaller drawing-room and quickly summoned Miss Lane. She entered with calm poise, though the shadows beneath her eyes hinted at sleepless nights. She greeted Holmes with civility, but without warmth. "I had not expected to see you again, Mr. Holmes." "I imagine not," Holmes replied gently. "But justice, as I have come to understand it, is not merely the apprehension of the guilty, it is the preservation of the innocent." Beatrice blinked, startled by the remark. "I read the local papers," Holmes continued. "The articles are unkind, some veiled, some direct. They imply a relationship between you and Mr. Weatherby, which never existed." Her lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. "I intend to correct that." Now, she looked at him directly. "And how do you propose to fight whispers, Mr. Holmes?" "Not with denial," Holmes said. "With evidence." He retrieved a small notebook from his coat pocket and flipped to a page. "Weatherby's letter. The final sentence you have seen. But it is not the only detail. The letter was dated 2 hours before Lord Eustace's death. It was written in haste but not regret. In it, he confessed not only to the act, but to the framing of you, stating explicitly that you were not his lover, nor his accomplice. It is signed, and the ink analysis confirms it matches a pen found in his own study. That letter, placed into the public record at the inquest, will do what I could not that morning, clear you completely." Beatrice's hand moved involuntarily to her throat. Her voice was hoarse when she finally spoke. "You would do that? Go to such lengths for me?" Holmes's face remained unreadable. "For the truth, Miss Lane. Though I will not deny that I find it most agreeable when the truth serves justice for its own sake." Her eyes glistened, not from sentiment, but relief. Real, human relief. "I thank you," she whispered. Watson and I left Weatherby Hall soon after, the snow crunching beneath our boots. As we reached the gates, I turned to Holmes. "You've done a good thing." Holmes adjusted his scarf and cast one final glance at the frost-covered windows behind us. "I have done what I should have done from the beginning. The mystery is solved, Watson, but only now is the story truly finished." We returned to London in the grey hush of dusk, the carriage wheels muffled beneath snow-packed slush, and the sky bruised with gathering twilight. I remember that ride with strange clarity, not for what was said, for Holmes was once again deep in one of his brooding silences, but for the air of finality that hung between us. A case may close, a name may be cleared, and yet the echo of deception lingers in the hollows of the soul. Back at Baker Street, Mrs. Hudson had lit the fire and drawn the curtains, and the warmth of the room seemed almost too civilized after the cold truths we had recently uncovered. Holmes dropped his coat on the hook and stood a long moment by the window, watching as the fog licked the lamplight along the street. "The press will receive the affidavit from the coroner tomorrow," he said finally, turning to me. "Lane's reputation will be restored. The public, as ever, will forget the details within a fortnight." "And you?" Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Will you forget her?" I asked. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he crossed to the mantel and adjusted a slight lean in the painting above it, an old landscape we both knew had hung crooked for months, yet had never drawn Holmes's attention until now. "She was not the mystery," he said finally. "She was the consequence of one, but she was also a victim." "Yes," he agreed quietly, "a victim of suggestion. That is the true power of misdirection, not merely to conceal, but to assign guilt where none exists." Weatherby's genius was not in the murder itself, but in the narrative. He knew how to place a thought in another's mind without speaking it aloud. I sat down, warmed my hands by the fire. It was a performance. Holmes turned. "Precisely. That is what struck me most. Each element was designed as if for the stage. A locked door, a bloodstain with no wound, a glove belonging to a woman of ambiguous status, the mysterious ash, all classic ingredients of a drawing-room enigma. And yet, it failed. "Because the world is not a stage," Holmes replied. "Not really. It refuses to conform. Reality is cluttered with mistakes, footprints out of place, tea leaves stirred unevenly, motives half-formed. If you try to write it too cleanly, it begins to look artificial. That was Weatherby's downfall. He wrote his story too well." He sat down, at last, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. "But it has led me to a thought, Watson, one I've considered before, but never so clearly. That the greatest crimes are not those of passion, but of narrative. The criminal who kills for money leaves a corpse and a motive. But the one who kills to tell a story, he leaves behind confusion, ambiguity, doubt. And that, Watson, is far more dangerous, because it does not merely end a life, it reshapes the truth." A silence settled then, heavy and reflective. I rose and fetched the small box that held our past cases, the mementos Holmes never spoke of, but never quite discarded. There was the twisted horseshoe from Dartmoor, the broken spectacles from the Ovington forgery affair, the monogrammed cufflink from the Opera House stabbing. I placed inside it now the lone glove from Weatherby Hall, sealed in an envelope marked simply, "The Christmas morning case." Holmes watched, but said nothing. The fire cracked gently between us. "I wonder sometimes," I mused, "if the stories will outlive the truth." "They always do," Holmes said with a dry smile. "But perhaps that is the only justice most men ever know." It was nearly midnight when we heard the distant bells of Street Marylebone chime the hour. Holmes had taken to his violin again, playing softly, not with his usual flourish, but a low, contemplative melody that echoed faintly like a question never fully answered. Outside, snow continued to fall, cloaking the streets in forgetfulness. But inside, where the light glowed softly upon the glove, the ashes, and the violin's polished wood, one memory remained sharp and untarnished. That of a Christmas morning Sherlock Holmes would never forget, not for the crime, but for the story that dared to rewrite innocence. And that, dear reader, was how the world once tried to pen a tragedy, but Holmes, ever the editor, rewrote it back to truth. The following day, I found Holmes at his desk in a state of rare, deliberate stillness. He was not reading, nor writing, nor even smoking. He simply sat, fingers laced together, staring down at the open casebook before him. The page was blank. That in itself was unusual. "Not recording the case?" I asked, easing into the chair across from him. Holmes glanced up, his gaze measured, as though weighing whether to speak. "There are cases," he said finally, "which do not benefit from the telling." I blinked. "You've never believed that before. You've always maintained that truth, well constructed, is the best safeguard against misunderstanding." "Yes," he agreed. "But this case, Watson, was not about misunderstanding. It was about intention. Weatherby intended to create an illusion, and illusions, when written down, can linger long after the facts have faded." I frowned. "You fear that even the telling might revive the doubt." "I fear," he said, "that truth, when framed incorrectly, becomes theater. And theater is not concerned with accuracy. It craves emotion." We had seen firsthand the speed with which public imagination had latched onto Beatrice Lane's involvement, however unfounded. Even in her vindication, the narrative of scandal had already taken hold. Gossip had sunk its claws, and society, once titillated, rarely offers apology. "So," I said, "you intend to let it vanish into silence?" Holmes shook his head. "Not silence, just discretion. The full details, the poison, the glove, the locked door can remain in the archive. But the names, the reputations, the emotions, they need not be set down. Let Lestrade enjoy his moment. Let the Weatherby name retire in dignified obscurity. Let Miss Lane walk through the streets without whispers. That is justice too." I reached into my coat and withdrew the copy of the Times. The editorial page featured a retraction of the earlier, more salacious column. "The young lady in question has been fully cleared of all suspicion by official inquiry, and no connection between her and the events of Christmas Day remains under consideration." Holmes read it, and made a sound somewhere between a grunt and a sigh. "It is a retraction," I said, "but not an apology. Newspapers rarely apologize. They only amend their narrative." "And yet," I said, "I will still write it." Holmes looked at me then, not surprised. "I will write it as fiction," I continued. "Names changed, settings disguised. I will leave no trace of Weatherby Hall, nor Lord Eustace, nor Miss Lane. But the truth, the mechanics of it, the mind behind the locked room, the fingerprints of misdirection, I will preserve that. Because people should know what to look for. In fiction, we may whisper lessons that the law cannot speak aloud." Holmes gave a small, ironic nod. "You always did understand the power of story, Watson. Perhaps better than I." He stood, reached for his coat, and moved toward the door. "Where are you off to?" I asked. "The British Museum, the Egyptian Gallery. I find that cases involving Ash and Atta are best concluded in the presence of old gods, and I am overdue for an afternoon with silence and stone." He paused at the threshold. "And you, Watson, write it well. Let the story do what Weatherby's could not reveal without wounding. You are better at that than I." With that, he vanished down the stairs, the soft thud of his footsteps quickly absorbed by the city's noise. I sat for some time in our rooms, staring into the fire, thinking of masks and performances, of those who suffer when shadows are mistaken for substance. When at last I took up my pen, I began not with the crime, nor the clues, nor even Holmes himself. I began with a young woman seated at a pianoforte, her hands hesitating on the keys, her future balanced between suspicion and silence. I wrote, There are stories that should never have been told, but must be remembered nonetheless. This is one of them. It began with snow and ended with ash, and between those truth, barely saved in time. Thus began my account, not of murder, but of what it takes to undo one. And as the ink dried on that first sentence, I knew that Holmes had been wrong about one thing. Some stories must be told, even if no one knows the names. It was weeks later, on an evening softened by the slow thaw of January, that I returned to Baker Street with the final manuscript in hand. I had polished the story with care, disguising all names and places, and presenting it as pure invention, a curious tale of misdirection, meant to entertain and subtly instruct. I had not shared it with Holmes until now, though its spirit haunted every page. He was seated, as ever, by the fire, a thin plume of smoke rising from his pipe, his long legs stretched before him, and a scientific monograph on the crystalline structure of strychnine abandoned on the floor beside his chair. I placed the pages gently on the table between us. "Fiction," I said simply, "as we agreed." Holmes regarded the manuscript with a curious expression. He did not immediately take it up. "You have called it?" he asked. "The Case of the Christmas Morning," I replied. "A mystery in 10 parts, one glove, one lie, and a winter's silence." At that, a flicker of amusement crossed his face. "Poetic. Not your usual style. I allowed myself some indulgence," I admitted. Holmes picked up the first page and scanned it quickly, his eye flicking across the lines with the same precision he gave to bloodstains and telegrams. As he read, the corners of his mouth twitched once, then again, but he said nothing until he reached the final line. Then he lowered the manuscript and regarded me for a long moment. "You have changed the ending," he said. I nodded, slightly. "In what way?" "In your version," I said quietly. "The story ended with silence and discretion. In mine, it ends with something else, acknowledgement. Not by name, not in the papers, but in the quiet justice of being remembered rightly. I gave her that. Much." Holmes exhaled slowly, a plume of smoke rising between us. "And that, Watson, is why you are the better man." I smiled. "Only the better storyteller." Holmes leaned back, setting the manuscript aside. "It is curious," he murmured, "how cases leave residues. Not facts, those we catalogue, dissect, and archive, but something more spectral. Emotional?" He gave a small nod. "Yes, though I rarely admit to such things. There are crimes that vanish once the handcuffs close. And then there are those that linger not because they were unsolved, but because they were unjust before they ever began." He rose then, wandered to the window, and looked down upon the street. London was restless beneath the amber glow of the lamps, the frost now patchy along the rooftops, the sound of hoofbeats muffled by the wet streets. "I passed Miss Lane 2 days ago," he said suddenly, "outside the Royal Society. She was with a publisher." "Truly?" "She was carrying a folio." I caught her eye briefly. She did not speak, nor did I, but she nodded, and "She is not a character anymore, Watson. She is her own narrator now." And in that moment, I understood Holmes in a way I never had. He, who so often saw the world as a puzzle to be solved, had in this case seen the delicate line between fiction and injustice, between evidence and consequence. He had not merely solved a murder, he had preserved a life from being rewritten by suspicion. I gestured to the fire. "Will you read it again?" "The story?" He hesitated, then gave a faint nod. "Not tonight, but I will." And I believed him. Later, as I prepared to leave for the evening, he stopped me at the door. "Watson," he said, "if you ever publish that story." "Yes?" "Leave the glove out." I frowned. "Why?" He smiled just enough to be noticed. "Because it's hers." I nodded, understanding. "Then I'll begin with the tea instead." he chuckled. A sound editorial decision. I left Baker Street with the London wind tugging at my coat and the knowledge that some mysteries, even solved, never truly end. They simply grow quiet like a violin's final note, vibrating softly in the memory. And somewhere in the fog, where shadows retreat and truth walks with its head held high, a woman with no glove walks unburdened at last. That, I thought, is the ending Holmes never wrote but always hoped for.